Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the next session, I guess, the 10:15 session. This is kind of cool. When we were trying to put together sessions, we had the idea we wanted to do something with maybe a little bit more of an Apple spin to it rather than a Casper Suite spin to it. And so as we were going around trying to figure out, who we could get to come and speak, we had the idea of, hey, let's get the two guys that actually wrote the book on it. So it's really exciting that they're here and they're able to do this. So I'd like to present Kevin White and Eric Dreyer.
I'm Eric. I'm really happy to be here. As Cam mentioned, we wrote the books. We are not Apple employees. So we're not Jamf employees, so we can say some things that Apple employees and Jamf employees can't say. Some of the books that I wrote that you might be familiar with is the OS X Server Essentials books. I've been doing those for a number of, I've been the co-author for a number of the versions. But I also wrote the ebook on Profile Manager with Lion Server. And that has a different price point. That's like $5. And I actually had a colleague come up to me and say, yeah, because it was only $5, I didn't think it was worth anything. So I said, oh. But my original, and then we've, in December 2013, we're going to have the new version of the OS X Server Essentials book out. But my original passion was directory services. That was the first book that I did with PeachPit, Kerberos, LDAP. Unfortunately, it kind of seems like no one really cares about that anymore. So I want to hand it off to Kevin.
So I have a similar story to tell. I'm responsible for the, we call it 101, but Support Essentials book. Been doing that for a long time, too. Again, sometime in December, the Mavericks version will be out. Apple, of course, has to ship an operating system first. So then we get to chop down trees after that and do all that other stuff that comes with making books. So December, and but to this audience, I might also be more famous for these two books. But again, Apple doesn't care about this stuff, so we don't have new versions of that anymore. So that's why we're here, and that's why we love Jamf, because they really care about those needs. So what's new in Apple deployment? And when Cam and I were talking about doing this and the date we had for the JNUC, we sort of thought more stuff would be ready. So this might really be what's the future of Apple deployment. And like Eric said, I work as an integrator for Jamf, but I am not a Jamf. I have worked for Apple before, but I'm no longer at Apple. So I can say stuff that they might not be willing to say. But I'm not going to violate NDA today. But we will talk about stuff as much as we can, given what we know right now. So we're going to start with what's Apple's point of view. We'll go into what's new with Configurator, what's new with over-the-air deployments, what's new with the App Store management, and then I'm going to hand it off to Eric, and he's going to talk about some of the new stuff with configuration profiles. So I want to start off first by talking about what Apple's goals are. Okay? What are Apple's goals? And a lot of folks in IT try to ignore Apple's goals. And you've got to remember that you're dealing with a company whose primary goal is this. That is their goal. Everything stems from that. And every time that IT makes a decision that goes against that, you're going to have some pain. Because it's like going to a Porsche dealership and complaining that it can't tow a lot. It wasn't made for that. Okay? We're dealing with a company that this is their goal. So when they design things and when they come out with implementations for us, you have to realize that's their primary goal for everything. So of course you have to ask, well, then who is Apple's customer? It's probably not you. Right? Apple's customer is the user. Apple's customer is the user. And everything they do stems from that, right? So Apple I mean, you know, you go to the Apple retail store, and those are temples, right? And Apple hires all these people that all they think about is the box and the opening of that box and the moment you turn on your iPad, that experience, right? That setup assistant. And everybody just wants to, oh, we got to get rid of that. We can't have users setting up their own equipment. That's crazy talk. That's Apple's plan. That's the out-of-the-box experience. I love people that go, we try to preserve the out-of-the-box experience, except for this 300-long list of crap that we do, right? And I understand that your goal in IT is to facilitate that kind of stuff and make that stuff easy for the user. But remember, this is what Apple wants you to preserve as much as you can, okay? So let's talk about one of the first things that you come across is this right here, right? Apple IDs. And this is another thing that, oh, we can't let users sign in with their Apple ID. We've got to skip that. This is more evidence. What does Apple care about? What is important to Apple in this relationship? Okay? This is the setup assistant for iOS. It's on an iPad. And I'm going to circle that text right there. What does that say? An Apple ID is your secure login for just about everything. Words matter at Apple. People have painful, long meetings at Apple about that sentence right there. Words matter. That's what Apple thinks, right? Here's OS 10. This is not Mavericks because I'm not violating NDA. So this is a previous version, current version, whatever. And this is one of the very first things it asks, right? And if a lot of people, oh, we can't have the users do that. We've got to skip that. But when you fill that out, this is the next screen. What does that say across the top? This is not your account. This is just the account you used to get into this computer. Think about the wording of that line there. I know it seems flippant, but this is what most people think of as identification for your systems, right? It's the user account. No, not in Apple's world. That's the computer account. No more than the passcode on my phone is me. It's just what I used to get into this computer. What really matters, you put your Apple ID in first, it fills that out for you right there based on your Apple ID. And then look at this checkbox that's checked by default. It's hard to see. I know these aren't red now. Allow my Apple ID to reset this user's password. What's the authoritative source of identity in this relationship? The Apple ID or your local account? Think about that. Think about that. Now, I'm not saying you should do this in your organization. I'm just saying that's Apple's point of view about how important the Apple ID is. And who does it belong to? Does it belong to you? No, it belongs to the user. It's their identification with Apple, okay? Apple ID services are mostly not intended for institutional use. Have you read the terms and conditions? Perfect nap time reading, apple.com/legal. But this is the iCloud T's and C's. I've highlighted the important stuff. Do not reveal your account information to anyone else. The service is designed and intended for personal use on an individual basis. That is the goal. Apple IDs belong to individuals, and the vast majority of those services belong to your users, not you. Now you can, of course, you know, I know these people that use Find My Device institutionally, and they have 1,000 Find My Devices on one Apple ID, and that's fine, and you can do that. That's not what it's designed for. And literally, legally, that's not what it's designed for. So when Apple makes changes about behavior that don't benefit the hacked way that you've used an Apple ID, don't be surprised. They didn't design it for that. So like this is a great example. People like to make these, you know, institutional Apple IDs for like iPad 1 through 300, and that's what people use. That's not what it's made for. Like this is a great example. If you have an Apple ID and you know the password of that Apple ID, you can go to this website and reset and add another email account to that Apple ID, and then that's the authentication for that Apple ID, right? So we got to get away from that, and there are solutions coming to help us get away from that, right? Oh, but think of the children. I got kids I got to deal with in K-12. Well, there's a program for that, actually. This is, I don't know that this is out yet, but this is on Apple's website. There will be a way for schools to set up en masse Apple IDs with parental consent for students under the age of 13. So each student will have their own individual Apple ID, and they'll be under the age of 13. So, but think about this. What do you have to put into your Apple ID setup? What's one of the key things that they know about you? Birthday, right? What do you think is going to happen when that kid turns 13? Do you think that's going to be your Apple ID anymore? Think about that. Right? So, okay, I just talked about how Apple IDs belong to people, not IT, okay? There's exceptions to these rules. In fact, these are great examples of Apple IDs that you should create that your team should know about, right? These services, you know, you don't want to lose the Apple ID for the person who set up your push certificate, right? Because you got to renew that every year. So there are some cases, yes, where obviously Apple IDs, you need to share those with the team. Right, so here's some examples. But when it comes to services, most of the services, those are the users' Apple IDs. Executive clicker. So let's talk a little bit about configurator. Configurator gets a bad rap, and I understand. It's constantly changing. It has bugs occasionally, and I'm sorry, as it turns out, there are issues sometimes. But it's evolving, and the other thing is I don't think people quite understand where it's coming from. So let's talk about, there have been other sessions this week that talk about basic configurator. We're not going to talk about that, but basically, if you don't know what it is, it's an app from the App Store for, it's the only way to turn on this thing called supervision right now. It's the only way to turn it on. And it's for mass configuring of iOS devices, mass deploying apps, and mass enrolling iOS devices, right? And what you may have noticed is there's this thing called supervision, and let's talk about it for a minute, right? You may have, if you've been paying attention to all the cool new hot iOS 7 features, almost all of them require supervision. Casper Focus requires supervision. So why does all the cool stuff need this thing called supervision? Well, because supervision proves that you should be allowed to control a device. That's what it is, right? You don't want your spouse's iPhone accidentally supervised. That would be really, really bad, because then some Russian mafia hacker would own that iPhone. We don't want that, right? And Apple cares about that kind of stuff because they don't want that to happen accidentally. So yes, supervision and going through that process may be kind of a pain. There's a reason for it. It's a security feature. So supervision proves that you have control. And how do we do that right now? Well, it's pretty easy. You have physical access to a device. You plug it into configurator. You turn on supervision mode. And that wipes the device and then re-images it with the latest version of iOS and then puts supervision mode on. So people complain, well, why do I have to wipe it? Well, again, you don't want to steal somebody's iPhone, supervise it, give it back to them, and then them not know. That wiping is intentional so that you can't sneak supervision onto somebody's phone, right? But now supervision has a big downside, and this is why it's probably not used by a lot of non-K-12 organizations. And that's this. It says, oh, you can't plug this device into another Mac anymore, or another PC or anything. So it's like you lost your Britney Spears iTunes. You know, all that stuff goes away. And that is a big downside. But oh my gosh, what's new in Configurator 1.4? Supervision and connecting to other Macs and PCs. That's pretty huge. I love that Apple releases these huge, like, for IT folk, like game-changing things on a random Tuesday via software update. Doesn't just read the K-base. It's going to change your life. You know, whatever. But this is awesome. They also introduced Apple TV 3 support. And there's some interesting new stuff in Prepare Setup that I want to talk about too. Interesting. So first of all, this is new, Configure 1.4, yay, supervision is on. But then I've got this awesome checkbox, allow devices to connect to other Macs. And I know that says Macs up there. It's other PCs too. So in other words, you can supervise a device, hand it to them and say, yep, plug it into iTunes, whatever. Use image capture, go ahead. You get all the awesome supervision, and you get your iTunes back. Yay, Apple. So now we can do this. Here's the catch. Not supervised, what do you have to do to it? Wipe it. Do it again. You supervised before this feature existed. You got to plug it back in and resupervise it with the checkbox. Okay? So just know that if you want this feature, that's great, but you're going to have to basically kind of redo all your devices, or at least plug them back into configurator and have it do its thing. But if you're already doing supervision, you know that every time you plug it in, it kind of does the whole rigmarole all over again anyhow. Okay, so just be prepared for that. I also want to talk about this right here. A lot of people like to restore from a backup, and the number one reason they like to do that is to get past Setup Assistant. But again, you're getting past the thing that Apple wants the users to go through. And Eric will talk more about this later, about containerization. iOS is designed specifically so that enterprise can have or institutions can have their data, and the user can have their own data. It just frustrates me, and it must frustrate people at Apple too, how many people don't allow iCloud. Oh, the user might do this, that, and the other. Yeah, that's the point. They're supposed to use it. That iCloud is for them. That's a service for them, right? So I don't like to restore backups because I want that Setup Assistant to run. I want the users to see that. But then, of course, we can put profiles on there and get it set up beforehand with the stuff that we care about so that they don't have to do that stuff, right? And I do want to stop here for a second. There's new behavior in the JSS, in the enrollment, okay? Prior to 9.2 or 9.1, I can't remember exactly the version, the enrollment was one file, and it contained both the trust and the enrollment information. And this really confused Configurator because it wanted to do it at the wrong time, because it wanted to do Wi-Fi, it wanted to do the Wi-Fi, it wanted to try to enroll before the Wi-Fi was on. And because here's the thing about this. People have talked about what order is this. Okay, here's the rule. It's supposed to do the right thing. I know that sounds crazy, but it was engineered so no matter how many things you give it, it makes intelligent choices about what's supposed to happen. Those of us with experience know those choices weren't always intelligent. So we've changed things at Jamf. We split out separately the trust profile from the enrollment profile. And you can see the Wi-Fi slipped right in between there. That Wi-Fi profile is a local one I made with Configurator to get it on Wi-Fi, so it does the right order. It trusts certificates first, jumps on the Wi-Fi, then enrolls last. Yay! So just so you know, new workflow. When you're on your JSS, you got to download two things. You got to download the trust profile, which is a certificate. And then you got to download that download button is actually downloading the enrollment profile. So you got to drag both those things in, and it should do the right order now, okay? So that's new behavior in both Configurator and JSS. So preserving that out-of-the-box experience, Configurator 1.4 plus iOS 7 and the new supervision mode means that you can hand somebody a device, an iPad that looks like it's out of the box. It's good. They get to go through the Setup Assistant, but you've already enrolled it, you've already managed it. They can plug it into iTunes. You get all the new supervision features, right? So Configurator really just manages that enrollment setup and supervision. User completes the Setup Assistant, do the rest with MDM, right? Push your apps and all that. You know, we're all Jamf customers. We have a great solution for handling all the rest of that stuff. Right? So that should be the workflow that you try to go for in the future. I realize that's not perfect for every environment, but that's really kind of this is the golden workflow. Right? All right, what's new with over the enrollment? I can't supervise my boss's iPhone. He's going to get it from the Apple Store, and he's going to bring it in. It's already going to be set up, right? So I got to over the enroll, okay? So let's talk about over the enrollment. But before we do that, I want to talk about this. This is a big deal right now, okay? iOS 7, if you turn on Find My Device, then it's automatically turned on. It's called Activation Lock, right? It's actually a really, really cool feature. I know it's hard to read in the screenshot, but basically you have Find My iPad turned on in this case, and it says, if your iPad is lost or stolen, it's locked. It's really cool. I'll show you some screenshots if you haven't seen this. This is what happens if somebody tries to do erase all content on an iPad that has this feature on. They have to enter my Apple ID. This is what happens if somebody hard resets it, puts it in service mode, wipes it, and puts on a new copy of iOS on there during Setup Assistant. Activate this iPad. You need to know that guy's Apple ID. This is awesome because you steal my iPad, it's a brick to you, man. Can't do anything about it. Here's what it looks like on iTunes. I can't nuke it with iTunes. Here's what it looks like even if I did nuke it using like Xcode or something else and I plug it back into iTunes, put in Kevin's Apple ID. Here's what happens in Configurator. Can't do it. This is really, really cool. unless it belongs to your company and that person just got fired. No, I'm serious. This is a cool feature, but guess what? Can you remove a device from activation lock? If you know the Apple ID. Yeah, there's an article on Apple's website. Go to iCloud, and you can go into the Find My Device, and you can disable that device. But again, just make sure that your employees do this before you fire them. And here's the deal. By the way, it should be called Find My Device because it finds Macs and stuff. So if anybody at Apple's listening, it's freaking Find My Device. But from the T's and C's again, the Find My iPhone and Find My Mac features are intended for personal use only. Okay? And I know you're going to use it institutionally. I don't blame you. It is a great feature. But realize that right now, that's where that feature is. It's intended for personal use only. Now, there may be things in the future that fix this, but right now, that's it. But that's really, so what does that have to do with BYOD or over-the-air enrollment? So sometimes a human resource policy is the only solution we can get, right? I've seen some places that when they're handing out, obviously a lot of schools that do one-to-ones, they have something the parent has to sign. Say, hey, if your device gets stolen, we need you to help us with your Apple ID to, we're going to go onto a website or you're going to help us try to find that. If we fire you and you still have our iPhone, great, we're going to take that out of your last paycheck. It's yours now. You've elected that, right? So right now, sometimes the only solution might be an HR policy. Right? So Setup Assistant plus over the air. So there's some interesting things in Configurator 1.4. How am I doing on time? I'm doing all right. Okay, cool. So there's that options button right there. And then I click on that and I can put in all this cool stuff about my organization. That's kind of weird. That's kind of cool. So you know what this does? This modifies Setup Assistant on that device so that there's a screen that pops up that says, hey, this device belongs to this company. By the way, you're setting it up, and the company or this school gave it to you. That's kind of cool. And then there's this interesting thing right here that's set up, enrollment profile, configure profiles, and then it asks for a URL and some trust certificates. That's really cool. I wish it worked. Well, it does work, sort of. So here's what this does. This is really slick. Okay, what this does is this bakes in enrollment information into the Setup Assistant on your iOS device so that there's a screen that pops up that says, hey, this device belongs to this company, and there's an MDM here. Let's enroll this device. There's one problem right now, that the other end of that URL isn't ready yet because this was just something that happened to get released on a random Tuesday by Apple, and we kind of didn't know about that. So, so I'm showing you that what this does. I'm talking about it, but I'm letting you know right now this does not work with the current JSS. They're obviously working on getting support for this in there, but I want to talk about this because next year at this time, I suspect everybody will do it that way. You got a new iPad. It's already seen Configurator maybe. You got the Setup Assistant. Oh, enroll your device. They put in their directory credentials to enroll, and it's all automagic, right? That would be really cool. Not quite there yet, I don't think. By the ways, configurator feedback. In Apple Configurator menu, provide configurator feedback. When we were first looking at Apple Configurator, this happened 2 days ago, I'm not kidding you. It said, allow other Macs to see this supervised device. And I'm like, Macs, does that mean I can't do Windows? So we went there. We spent like 10 minutes getting a good question. Don't go here to ask for stupid help questions. Go here to ask a legitimate question. Our legitimate question is, it says Mac, does that not mean Windows? Like, that's a good question. And I swear it took more time for us to write the question than the response. And the response was, oh yeah, it does work with Windows. And I'm sure on the back end, it's like, well, we need to update our screen to say Macs or other PCs or something. So don't go here just to complain. If you've got a good, legitimate question or a good, legitimate feature request, this is the place to go for that. Configurator's evolving. Obviously, new stuff comes out all the time. Please provide feedback about what you need. That one checkbox alone is, I'm sure, a big win for a lot of people. So streamlined MDM enrollment. officially removed from the iOS 7 features page. Okay, so for those of you who remember, when iOS 7 was announced, there's this cool thing called Streamline Enrollment, and we're like, man, that's cool. And then you go back a couple weeks ago, and it's gone. But you know what? It was up long enough. You can find it on Google Cache. I'm still going to talk about it. Okay. Because that is public knowledge. I am not violating NDA by talking about that statement right there. So institutionally owned devices can be automatically enrolled in MDM during activation. Wow, that sounds like what Kevin was just talking about in the configurator thing. Cool. IT can now supervise devices over the air. I'm going to read that again. IT can now supervise devices over the air. Well, that's really kind of cool, because supervision gets me all this neat stuff and proves that I own control of that device. But right now, I have to use configurator for it. That statement leads me to believe that I shouldn't assume that supervision is a unique feature to configurator. Literally says supervise devices over the air, right there. So through what mechanism could a new Apple device know that it needs to be supervised? Through what mechanism does Apple know that an organization just bought a bunch of iPads? When you buy them from them, directly, they know that those are yours. So it shouldn't come as a surprise when this becomes available later that it's for devices that you just bought from Apple. It should not surprise you if, when this comes out later, it's for devices that you just bought from Apple. That shouldn't surprise you. Moving on.
You're going to mention CSS?
Oh, yeah. Well, save me time.
All right.
So, but we saw that configurator, right? Configurator, I can supervise and have that enrollment thing, right? So there's configurator. Still, remember, you can still do that with configurator. So what's new with App Store management? Okay, let go of your hate. It's going to get better. So, T's and C's again. Just if there's any confusion about what you're allowed to do with Mac App Store content, it is designed so that individuals can put stuff on your devices, right? That you own or control. That you own or control. Company bought me an iPhone. I'm using it. Who's in control? Me. If you are a commercial enterprise, you can put things that you own or control on multiple items on a single shared Mac that you own or control. We both own or control this device. So we can put institutional things and Apple things. This is Apple's own layered model. They have had a PDF for version 5 and 6, and I'm sure there's a new one for 7. There should be no question that the way it's licensed is one device, 2 separate forms of ownership on that device, totally legitimate, right? So let's talk about VPP. So for those of you who don't know, there's this program called VPP, lets institutions buy in bulk. And just like every Apple product, what you really want is version 2. Everybody who knows this program knows what's wrong with this program. So, soon to be VPP. Assign apps to their users while keeping full ownership and control of app licenses. Woohoo! But here's the thing, and everybody that knows about VPP knows, like, that's awesome. Enroll with their personal Apple IDs without providing it to their company. I'm going to read that again. Users enroll with their personal Apple IDs without providing it to you. Whose Apple ID is it? It's theirs. That's right. It's their Apple ID. And you won't even know what it is. But you're going to be able to give that a license for Pages, Keynote, whatever. And if they get fired, great, taking it back. But you don't know that Apple ID. That's cool. Now, we can't talk about the implementation of that. It doesn't exist yet. Like I said, future of Mac deployment, or future of Apple deployment. But let's talk about updates. So obviously, this stuff's coming from the App Store, right? It's got to come from the App Store. It can't come from your JDS, as badass as it is. It's coming from the App Store, right? And Apple also means automatic now, right? Great big iOS 7 feature. Automatic updates means automatic. This is 10.6. Updates come, but the default setting, I'm sorry, in 10.8. 10.8. I've written so many books, I get confused. This is the default settings. Automatically download stuff, just let me know. Now, those of you who know, in current version, you still have to be an admin to do this. Are there admins on iOS 7? On your iPad? So automatic updates are on, so who can be using the device and it updates? Anybody. So it shouldn't come as a surprise to you if future versions of OS 10 don't even care if you're an admin. I'm just saying that shouldn't surprise you. If future versions of OS 10 don't even care if you're an admin, they're just going to run updates. Shouldn't surprise you. Moving on. So caching service, that's going to become really important to you because all this stuff's coming from Apple. Current version, if you don't know what it does, zero client configuration, anything for OS 10, Mac App Store, and iOS apps only through iTunes. That's current version. Automatically caches requests, zero client config. New version's coming out, and yellow stuff is important. App Store, Mac App Store, iTunes Store, and iBook Store. So this is caching service version 2. All content, essentially, that's big that you care about from Apple. Caveats. Assumes basic NAT networking. That first bullet point is the real big issue with caching server. If you read any documentation about it, yeah, this is the one thing about it. Actually, there's a couple things. Devices and services share, they have to share the same public IPv4 address. So there are some scalability issues with caching server right now. But if you're that big, you got the bandwidth. You don't need caching server. No, but you don't control this content. It's automatic. You just tell it how big you want it to be. And last one, this is a proprietary solution. It is likely that caching server will not be open sourced anytime soon. I like to think that the Apple server team tries to come up with reasons to buy Mac Mini servers. And it's a legitimate thing, and this is probably going to be the reason that next year at this time, you guys are all going to have Mac Mini servers all over the place. Because this will be the only way to get this service. And if you want to look into the technical details, get to it, but there's a reasons for it. All right, so I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to hand it over to Eric.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you. The last bit of this presentation, we want to share with you some of the new things about configuration profiles for iOS 7. There's the list of all the really cool features. Some of them have been mentioned, and there's even been sessions about them. But I'm going to try to take these and organize them into a different way than just a bullet list. First of all, if you've got a developer ID, you can read this configuration profile reference. This has all the nitty-gritty details of all the configuration profiles, all the settings, the keys, and everything. It's aimed at developers, but there's nuggets of information that you can find in there that will help you understand, does this work under supervision only? Does this work under management? So this will help you decipher what's going on with the things that you see in the UI. Just a quick reminder about supervision, that there's some features that are only available under supervision. And another reminder about managed apps. There's a really good session from the first day that has some really good demos about managed apps. And again, in order for the app to be considered managed, it has to be installed through the MDM, whether that's JSS or any other third-party MDM. That the unreleased caching service, the caching server 2 that Kevin just mentioned, that's going to be really handy. If your users need to remove their apps, then get managed, and then apply those apps under management. When I was putting my demos together, I was constantly erasing and wiping my iPad and removing and installing Keynote. And I brought my little Mac Mini server, brought a little Airport Extreme, and I just kept downloading Keynote from my caching server. It was just really quick. I also brought a 3G, 4G hotspot because I needed an environment where I could be sure that I was online. So some of the three main things for the new iOS 7 configuration profiles allow you to restrict your users, to containerize data, and to assist users. So I'm going to talk about each of these three in overall terms, these three things. Now, the first one is restricting your users. Just because you can restrict them doesn't mean you should. Especially when you get a new system and there's all these checkboxes like, oh, wow, I can restrict AirDrop. Cool, I can restrict the photo. I know that everyone's needs are different. There may be a real reason that you need to restrict the user from doing things that are fun and cool, but think really hard before you pull that switch, before you uncheck that, before you deselect that checkbox. So I don't want to talk about restricting users. What I really want to talk about, the exciting thing for me is the containerization. It allows you, as Kevin mentioned earlier, it allows you to take an iOS device, have organizational data and personal data without having to log in and log out on an iOS device. Because you can't log in and log out on an iOS device. You're using that iOS device, and you're using different apps, and we want to keep the organizational data separate from the personal data. That's mostly in businesses. In education, I don't see a lot of concern about containerization for students. The students can use the data, and we're not really concerned about students doing things that leak out into their personal stuff. So can break this down, break the containerization down into protecting data at rest, protecting data in transit, and one of the ways we do that is separate out files, apps, and network traffic. So let's talk about data at rest. We got the managed open-in and the restrict app data backup. The managed open-in is a way of saying, all right, well, you've got some data, and for the things that are managed, for the organizational apps, those can all talk to each other. Those can all share data. And then for the things that are personal, those can share. There's a checkbox in the JSS. So the first one is allow documents from managed apps in unmanaged apps. Deselect that. The second one, allow documents from unmanaged apps in managed apps. So to make sense of it, I think you need to play with this, think about it a little bit, try some workflows out, see which of these options or both meet your needs to separate organization from personal data. One of the things that IT likes to do is say, no, you can't back this up because there's a chance that there's data on here, and if I fire you and you go home and you restore your backup to your personal device, I don't want that data leaking. So I say we're controlling the backup, but all we really care about is controlling the restore, right? We care about leaking through restoring. Leaking through restoring. Someone's look up if that's .com is reserved. So one way to do that is to just say disallow all backup. We can do this in iOS 6. In the JSS, we can deselect that checkbox to allow iCloud backup. In Configurator, we can deselect that checkbox to allow devices to connect to other Macs. So no backups. But there's a better way to just prevent the restore of the organizational backup. Just to prevent the restore of the organizational data. So you have to limit the backup of organizational data. So there we've got that checkbox, prevent backup of app data. So I took, this is a screenshot from the configuration profile for the box for iPhone and iPad. I had to manage that app in order for that checkbox to be available, in order for that app to be managed. So again, that means that app has to be installed while under an MDM's control.
Look around.
VPN is another way of protecting data in transit. One way is to say, all right, hey, all this device's traffic is going to go through my organization's VPN. But maybe you don't want your employees' personal photos to touch your organization's VPN. You don't want their Netflix viewing to go through your VPN. So you can say, all right, well, for these managed apps, for these apps that are for the organization, those will go through the VPN. Everything else will just go through whatever connection that the user happens to have. And it actually turns out that it's more efficient to do per app VPN because the app is responsible for sending traffic through the VPN, and the very core level of iOS doesn't have to send all traffic through the VPN. So before iOS 7, we didn't have this possibility, and we would just facilitate global VPN. So for this entire iOS device, here's the VPN. I can facilitate that for the user. But now with iOS 7, we can define apps, we can define managed apps, and then define, well, here's the checklist. You create the per app VPN, you create the, you manage the app, and then for each managed app, you specify which of those per app VPNs, which of those VPN connections you use. So here's an example. I've got, in my VPN profile, I selected per app VPN, and then I have to select in this checkbox, in the drop-down menu, which third-party VPN I'm going to use. You have to use a third-party VPN concentrator or VPN product like Cisco, Juniper, F5. Let me go back 2 slides and show for the global. For the global, we've got just generic L2TP and PPTP. But for the iOS 7 only, we've got to use that third party. So we define the VPN information, and then for the managed app, we choose which VPN session we're going to use. So you could have multiple apps using the same VPN connection, or if you're really fancy, you could have different apps using different VPN connections. Knock yourself out. So in addition to restricting users and containerizing, the third thing I want to talk about is assisting users. So some examples of using iOS 7 specific configuration profiles are adding fonts, automatically configuring apps, gathering feedback from those apps, using AirPrint and AirPlay, and facilitate single sign-on. So just wanted to have a demo. So the iOS devices don't have Comic Sans. But Comic Sans is really important. So this demo, I'm going to walk you through, there's a bunch of slides in here. I want to walk you through an end-to-end workflow of configuring a device, putting a font on it, seeing that the font didn't take, then managing it, having that app be managed, and then the font takes. Removing it from management, the font disappears. So this is an example of some of the things that you might want to play with just to figure out how this is going to work for you. So Comic Sans. So first of all, I've got this device. I used Configurator to put it under supervision so that it's easy for me to add and remove the enrollment profile without having to log in and anything. I just, in Configurator, I can just select that checkbox for the MDM profile, and it's enrolled. It's pretty fantastic. It's pretty amazing. So again, this is starting off with an iOS device that's supervised but not enrolled in an MDM yet. I took a keynote on a Mac and created a quick 2-page keynote with Comic Sans. And so that first line, Comic Sans bold, is in Comic Sans bold. And just as a reminder, I got another line underneath that says, hey, that line should be in Comic Sans bold. With me so far? All right, so I'm going to save that to a WebDAV server. And on my iOS device, I'm going to go in, use my Apple ID, and download Keynote. Even though it's supervised, I can still log in with I can still use my Apple ID to download apps. So I've got Keynote, and I click the plus button. I want to add a document. I want to copy it from a WebDAV server. Oh, there's server 17. Excellent. I love server 17. I sign in. I go to the Keynotes folder. There's some Keynotes that I've got. I'm going to grab my Comic Sans example. And I'd seen the preview. Comic Sans. That looks good. But I get this warning saying, hey, this is edited on a Mac. This might not look right. OK, sure. It looked fine in the preview. Yeah, OK, fonts are missing. OK, done. It's not in Comic Sans. Oh. I really like Comic Sans. All right, so what about the second page? Nope, that's not there either. OK, so in my MDM, I'm going to create a configuration profile with a font. All right, so created the configuration profile, selected font. I'm going to go enter the font name, Comic Sans MS, click the upload font file, find that file. It's in library fonts. There's Comic Sans. I'm going to choose that, upload it, save that. Oh, I got to scope it and save it. All right, and with Supervisor, with Configurator, I'm tethered. I'm going to select those checkboxes, enroll my device. Great, I can see in my list of profiles, I've got the MDM profile, I'm enrolled. I've got my Comic Sans profiles, excellent. So I'm going to switch back over to Keynote and
here's the managed app.
Open that. I'm going to delete it because it's not showing. I should have shown that it's still not showing. So I'm going to delete that presentation, and I'm going to upload it again, just to see if I've got my font now. No, it's still not there. All right. Well, I'm going to delete Keynote from the iPad altogether. Yeah, I want to delete it, and it's data. Okay. And then I'm going to go to self-service under MDM and install Keynote. And of course, still can use my Apple ID through MDM, load it from the cloud, and WebDev, open up that Keynote presentation again. Looks good so far. It might look different. Will it? Yes, Comic Sans. All right, what about the second page? Yes, all right, great. So it's a lot of work to get Comic Sans on your iOS device, but now you know the procedure. What I'm going to do, just to have fun, I'm going to remove the MDM profile. I'm going to remove the MDM profile. Oh, this slide doesn't belong there. That's just what the Comic Sans configuration profile looks like. But once I remove the MDM profile, I'm going to remove it, and now all the rest of the things are disappearing. There's one last. There's the Tahoma font configuration profile is the last one to go. Now I'm back to being not in the MDM. So what happens when I go to Keynote? I see a show of hands of people who think Comic Sans will still be there. All right, a few people. OK. So, wow, that's weird. There's no text at all. Well, what about this slide?
That's your carrot.
That's not in Comic Sans. All right. So, wow, that's kind of weird. All right. So, what happens if I re-enroll? Oh, Comic Sans is back. Nice. So, the recap of that walkthrough was that first we had no native Comic Sans on an iOS device. We enrolled in MDM with the Comic Sans profile. The Keynote still didn't display the font. I had to remove and reinstall that app under management. And then the Keynote displays that font from the configuration profile while when that profile is installed. Oh no. This is the wrong deck, right? This is the one with the Comic Sans and the rest of it. No, it's not. One of the other things that is cool in the category of helping your users is this automatically configuring apps. And someday we'll look back and say, wow, it's really amazing that this was new to us. And we had no idea what this was. So here's an example of for Box, the Box app. If you go to App Configuration tab, you can enter in some configuration blob. I don't know what that is yet. There's a great video from the first day session on managed apps that has an example of what kind of configuration information and what form that is. But basically, this allows you, as an administrator, to help the user, to give them a bunch of settings to pre-populate things that are useful for that app to work. So they don't have to enter in all this stuff themselves. It's like, all right, here you go. Here's the configuration. Here's where that server lives. Here's the URL. I haven't used this yet. This is brand new. And like I said, someday we'll look back and say, wow, I can't believe this was new to us at one point. Another thing that's really neat, I mentioned earlier that I wrote that directory services book. It's all about Kerberos and how cool Kerberos is, and you got the ticket granting ticket and the service granting ticket. Kerberos is really awesome, and I thought, once we decided not to redo that directory services book, that no one really cares about Kerberos anymore. I was wrong. Kerberos is still really awesome, and iOS 7 facilitates the use of Kerberos. So basically, with OS 10, you can bind to Active Directory. You can bind to Open Directory. And that allows your OS 10 computer to play with Kerberos. It's a no-brainer. You just bind. But on an iOS device, you can't bind. So there's that way of telling an iOS device what Kerberos realm to play in, that's not available to us. But with the configuration profile, that's a way of saying, hey, here's where the Kerberos realm is. Here are some sites. Here's some URLs that you should use Kerberos for. Here are some apps that should use Kerberos. And for the most part, it's a really simple. It's really easy for app developers to use Kerberos to Kerberize their apps. AirPlay and AirPrint, it's easy to use configuration profiles to facilitate users using the appropriate resource. And again, demos from a previous session. So again, just a recap of the iOS 7 only configuration profile stuff. Broke it down into 3 different categories: stuff to restrict users, stuff to containerize data, and the stuff to help users access the resources they need. In this session, we're done. Just a quick recap before questions and answers. We looked at, Kevin did a great job of talking about understanding what Apple's goals are. We looked at some of the new things in the absolutely newest version of Configurator. Maybe there'll be something new to talk about at some point later on down the line, because that's what always happens. What's new with enrollment, app management, and configuration profiles. So with that, we thank you very much, and we take it open for questions.
Good job. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Questions?
All right, so I'm an administrator.
Yeah.
You sold me on using Apple IDs now. I used to I don't want to. I need a little control. Should I restrict people to Apple IDs on my domain, or am I trying too hard still?
So the question is, you've convinced me I'm going to use Apple IDs. Should I restrict people to only using Apple IDs on my domain? I'd say no.
No.
Let them use whatever, Yahoo. Yep.
Well, he talked about managed OpenN and controlling corporate data, right? Those features are there so that stuff doesn't end up in their Apple ID or in something that is like their iCloud or their messages, right? And so, it's their Apple ID, let them use it. If it's their data that they're using their Apple ID for, they're going to use it at home anyhow on another device.
So they walk away with their iPad, and I can, if it's on my domain, if it's one of my cards, I can just reset that password and get into it. Doesn't that give you a little bit more control?
Oh, so the follow-up was, well, if it's on my domain, if it's my, at .com, then I can go and manage it. No, not quite. And also keep in mind that if they know the Apple ID and the password, they can go to the Manage My Apple ID. They can enter in their Yahoo account, remove your account, and you now have no recourse. You can't say, oh, but that Apple ID was originally xyz.com. I want that back. No, now it's there. Yeah.
Right? When you make an Apple ID that's not like at me, or actually I guess you can only do at cloud now, at iCloud. Mm-hmm. Any Apple ID that's not at iCloud, that email address is not the Apple ID.
That is fungible.
That's fungible. That's just, your Apple ID is some pie in the sky number, and at any point the user can go back here, put in another email address, verify it with an email to that email address, the one they just added, not the old one, the one they just added. And then once that is done, they can delete the other email address, right? So it doesn't really matter whether it's on your domain. I would actually suggest that you might, there's no reason you couldn't have 2 Apple IDs, right? You have the work one, and then you have the personal one.
That gets
and
complicated.
it gets complicated as to who's who.
Updates.
But remember, when it comes to like the VPP version 2, whatever it's going to be called, you're not even supposed to know their Apple ID. When those apps get applied, it said you don't even know the Apple ID.
The other side of that is keep in mind when dealing with iCloud stuff, if your Apple ID is non-Apple-oriented, Mac.com, some of the things aren't going to sync. Mail, notes.
Do you want to
So
repeat that?
The comment was when your Apple ID doesn't end in that Apple domain .me.mac.icloud, some things don't work correctly, and I'm not aware of that.
Like Find My Device, you can only have one Apple ID that does that, right?
But you said something like notes don't sync.
Syncing notes requires an iCloud.com.
Oh,
Can anybody verify that? I think it's as long as it's IMAP, it should sync notes. Yeah, as long there are some services that require certain types of email. Like, for example, if you're using Gmail and you're in corporate Gmail where you turn off IMAP, that's a great example because it looks normally, if you have a normal Gmail account and you put that in, you can sync notes. But if you turn off IMAP as an institution for Gmail, then that does fail. So there are certain situations absolutely where certain things don't sync right, and that is kind of on a per service basis. Any other questions?
In the slides, it shows that the VPN connections are at are a third-party VPN solution. I was just curious, older Cisco boxes use straight up IPsec and VPN. Do you know if there's any reason why they would do this?
So the question was, I had mentioned that the per app VPN required third-party VPN. Some of the older Cisco boxes do Cisco just IPsec rather than any connect. Why do they make that choice? There's probably a lot of meetings about it, and there's probably some resource contention, and this is the way to move forward.
Well, it also requires that your VPN supports on-demand, right?
Yep.
So it's based on on-demand VPN connections, which require a certain type of setup, right? Because it's just, instead of it being a domain-based thing, you launched an app, and that kicked off the on-demand connection, and then it's just that app that has that connection. So that's really, the app-based is really just adding another layer of targeting that VPN connection to that launch of that app, right?
So just to be clear, neither one of us work for Apple, neither one of us work for Jamf. So ask for reasons why people do things. These are our conjectures. This is what we see from our experience. So, right.
Can you comment on the relationship between activation lock and supervision?
The question was, can you comment on the relationship between activation lock and supervision?
So the feature about being able to supervise over the air. So if you supervise something, it proves that you own something, right? That's what that word sort of means. And if we can supervise something before it is even handed to the user, that means that I own it. And there's another mechanism right now, is the activation lock, is a similar mechanism. It's just based on a personal Apple ID. There might be a relationship with that in the future.
Was there?
But I mean, that product's not out, so I can't say, and I don't work for Apple, and I can't speak for them, so I can't confirm that that's going to happen, but that appears to be something that could be, yeah.
Long term, certainly. The articles that are out today, or recently, about supervision from configurator getting around its correct situations.
Well, you saw that screenshot was configurator 1.4. There is, are you talking about the bug about that?
I don't know if it's a bug.
Yeah, I don't.
Was there something you were trying to get us to say?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
Because you could just say it.
Okay. All right.
That was an awesome non-answer, wasn't it?
Well,
Maybe I should run for politics. It's a good non-answer.
Any other questions?
Oh,
Yeah.
just to go quickly over the font installation. The fonts have to be on the device initially from the profile installation. Then the apps can be reinstalled anyway. They have to be managed.
They have to be managed. But actually,
Make sure.
so the question was, all right, the fonts are on the device, and does the app have to be managed? I'm not actually sure. That was my, I spent days putting that workflow together, and that was my experience. And I was connected up to configurator, and that. That was really dumb. I was tethered, and I would remove the MDM profile. Be like, okay, cool. And I'd look again. I'm like, but I'm back on the MDM profile. What is going on?
Configurator's reapplying.
Configurator is like, okay, I'm refreshing.
Yeah, we didn't
every
show
time.
that. We didn't show that checkbox. There's the checkbox in configurator's preferences. That's basically remove anything I didn't do, and replace it again. And if you've used configurator before, you know about that checkbox.
So
we should have talked about
that's
that.
a great question. For fonts, does the app need to be managed? I think so, but I'm not sure.
But it definitely has to be supervised. Eric.
Oh, it has to be supervised.
The device, I believe, has to be supervised for fonts to work, correct? No. It does not? No. Thanks, Reese.
We got a question up in the back?
Ask him. Do you have a, Reese?
Just to clarify, fonts can be loaded, doesn't have to be supervised, and they don't have to go through a VM. They can be rolled into a profile.
I think that, so it doesn't have to be supervised. So Reese says it doesn't have to be supervised. I think the question is, does the app have to be managed?
And Reese says no.
And Reese says no. There you go.
It just has to be reinstalled. All right. So my workflow was just a bunch of hooey.
With a little bit more. You do need to quit
Swipe up.
So,
and relaunch it so that it rereads the list.
all right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Reese.
Way at the top. I see you up there.
Yeah, if you do the supervise and you let them connect to the Mac, do they restore backups from iTunes onto the device?
Yeah, because backups don't, there could be a whole session about what backups do and do not do. And I think a lot of people get confused and assume that a backup will like entirely replace everything. Well, they can still plug it into iTunes. They can't do a full restore. So I'm not sure that the backup will actually complete, but the other things from iTunes can get back into there.
And that question was?
And I don't believe they can, I didn't actually test. I don't think you can do a backup. But if the data was outside of the backup, which a lot of data ends up outside of that backup, they can still plug it into iTunes and sync it.
So that just,
Like if they have their own device and then you want to supervise to have some features and they already had some, backups on their iTunes, because then they put it back the way it was.
so the question the question was, if a device is supervised and you have that, and you selected the checkbox to allow devices to connect to other Macs, can that device be backed up to iTunes? And with the follow-up that, well, what if they've already had backups of that device? The follow-up to the follow-up is that, remember, to put it under supervision, it has to wipe it. So that's an interesting question that we don't know the answer to yet.
Yeah, you can. I don't believe you can restore backup, but you can get other things out of it. Everything, basically everything else that iTunes does, you can get over. Yeah. Yeah, that'd be a good session.
Question in the dark.
I know you can't say much about it, but we kept hinting about, that whole MDM profile. So when you have your setup, that the thing that's not working yet.
Uh-huh.
So if that works and you have your own Apple Vision tokenized apps you're giving the users, they use that like even all that. When a user is installing those, are the users still checking it out through the App Store, or is it checking out through your MDM solutions attaching to service? You kind of hinted at something like that's something that may be built in.
That's a great question. I'm not really going to repeat it because it's not the one that we can answer.
But
Thanks for trying.
yeah, thanks for trying. App Store content can only be deployed via, that is something that's not your app. It's either configurator or directly from the App Store. And it's always going to be. So regardless of your workflow of getting to how do I give that to my user, it's always either going to be through configurator or over the air, and that's why caching servers are important. Does that sort of help, though?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
All right.
You can talk to us afterwards.
Yeah. How are we doing on time?
Regarding SSO, we use LDAP to sync student accounts to their MacBooks, but they also use Google Docs a lot, which has a totally different domain to it. It's like an student. With SSO, those two, you will have multiple single sign-on credentials for one device.
So the question is, are you able to have multiple single sign-on credentials for one device?
I think you can because the profiles, you specify the URL that a principal is allowed to access.
You specify the realm.
And you specify the realm and the
apps,
principal.
URLs.
That's a good question.
I saw that up on one of your slides where you had multiple realms on there. So.
Yeah, the question is, so if you look at the profile, that's an SSO profile, it contains the Kerberos realm, the user principal, and the URL that they're allowed to access with that information. So you could have multiples of those. I don't know what would happen if I had 2 different user principals and realms, but a matching URL against 2 profiles. Yeah, that probably wouldn't work because it wouldn't know which account to use for that same URL. But if they were going in different directions to different URLs, that should work.
Guys, I got one way up at the top there.
Yeah.
Hey, so I saw in your presentation that you briefly talked about the Apple TV there for a second. I went through that whole first day where they kind of pulled back that iOS 7 version that went to the Apple TV. So I had a fun day trying to get enrolled. I saw you mentioned the Apple TV 3. Does that mean that the iOS 7 capabilities aren't supported on the Apple TV 2?
Does anybody know that answer? 2 or 3. So that's just a typo, fat finger.
What was the question?
The question was, does it only work on Apple TV 3s? And the answer is no, it only works 2s and 3s. So the little black ones. Good question, thanks. And that's clearly a typo. We had 150 slides to make in like 3 days, so.
3 months.
What do you think?
3 months. But we didn't know what was going to be out this week, right? So it's like, well, what can we talk about that's out?
Come back next week.
Yeah, come back. No indication.
Got one
of
up
that.
there.
I'm just curious, do you do branches in the caching server?
So the question was, can you branch in the caching server? And the answer is, you can't do anything in the caching server except say how much space it wants to take up.
No, but you can have multiple.
But they have to be, they have to be VLAN. Because it's just going to go to whichever one it can find in that LAN.
Yeah, it's automatic. The client just says, oh,
so
well,
the
here's one
caching
that's
server is
close.
automatic. It caches whatever clients request. Caching server is a caching service. It is not a control service. Okay? It's called the caching server because it caches. It's not called software control service. It's called software caching service, right? So it's for caching.
There is a knowledge base at support.apple.com on advanced configuration, and you can segment it out by LAN.
Yeah, but because there. Okay, so if you're confusing it with Apple software update services, I can point to a specific Apple software update server, and then when they go home, they're still calling back to that server, right? That's not how caching server works. They go home, they run updates, they're on their local network, and it's going to get whatever they can get, right? So even though we could split out the caching server and have some VLAN stuff going on, it doesn't matter. As soon as they go to Starbucks and run updates, it's going to get whatever's available from Apple, right? So it's not a control mechanism, it's a caching mechanism.
And the caching servers will talk to each other intelligently and essentially load balance.
Oh, that's cool.
So the comment was the caching servers will communicate with each other intelligently and share their content with each other and effectively load balance.
If a user connects to a caching, it's like, I'm looking up and it's like tennis. They look at me and then they look over there.
He said it's like tennis, that you look at them and they look back. He said so.
User goes to a caching server and they connect and they start to download, and that caching server doesn't have all what they need. It will automatically just point them to another one. There's no interaction by you or the user necessary.
So what was said was that if, let's say, Kevin is a Mac Mini, Kevin is a caching service and I'm a caching service, and someone asks, Kevin has that asset, I don't have that asset, someone asks me for the asset, I just hand it off and say, oh, get that asset from Kevin. And then I'll also grab it myself. So the next time someone asks me, I don't have to tell them to go to Kevin.
And so if anybody knows anything about how Apple likes to aggressively cache locally on OS X, like they've extended that to your caching servers. Their job is to cache. They cache as much as they can, as smart as they can, because it's all about increasing performance. That's really all it's about, is increasing performance.
All right, we have time for one more, if anybody has one.
Oh, yeah.
You were talking before about the limitations of the caching server. Are some of those limitations like talking across VLANs and things like that?
So the K-base, the question is, there's limitations to the caching server. Is there anything that we can do about VLANs, basically? This gentleman mentioned there is a K-base about if you do have multiple caching servers on VLANs, you can sort of make the caching servers aware of those VLANs. The only issue is, on the other side, on the outside, to the outside world, they all still have to go through NAT, right?
So basically what happens is the caching service, when you turn it on, it tells Apple, it says, hey, I'd like to be a caching service. Here's my address. Internally, here's the network range that I want to serve. Here's my external address. And so when a client says, hey, Apple, I need an update, Apple looks at the public IPv4 address in the country, looks at a bunch of stuff and says, oh, well, here are the information. You should try getting it from, this is what I think is the appropriate caching service to get it from. Just a quick follow-up about the caching service. I want to share a story. I had a Mac Mini, and I wanted to change the hard drive. So I took it out and popped the cable out. But instead of popping the cable, I popped the chip off. So I took it to the Genius Bar and said, I'm really dumb. I popped this chip off. How much is it going to cost? And they're like, we'll make a one-time exception, and we'll replace the motherboard for you. And I said, wow, great. And I came back a couple days later, got it, and fired up the caching service, to write the books and stuff, and it wouldn't work. And that Mac Mini, it just wouldn't work. My MacBook Airs would work, all these other things would work, but just not that Mac Mini. And finally, someone said, what's the serial number of your machine, of your computer? And turns out that when that replacement motherboard was reserialized, they left one character out. So that because Apple didn't know my hardware address, it didn't match something, the caching service, the Apple's registration service said, I'm not gonna.
So that's why I talked about proprietary and likely to stay that way. It verifies your serial number. So no VMs. It's Apple hardware. Yay, Mac Minis for everyone.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Awesome.